My mother-in-law left me standing in a torrential downpour 40 miles from home. She rolled down the tinted window of her luxury sedan just enough to let the warm air escape, looked me dead in the eyes, and told me I needed a lesson in respect. I did not argue. I just stood in the freezing rain and watched her drive away, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. She fully expected me to break down, cry, and beg for her mercy. But a luxury car pulled up moments later. My bodyguard stepped out calm and ready. I smiled as I climbed into the warm leather seat. Her cruelty had finally ended, and this was her last mistake. My name is Zariah. I am 32 years old, a proud Spelman alumna, and the founder of a high-end crisis management and private security firm in Atlanta. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. I am currently standing in the living room of my glass penthouse, high above the glittering Atlanta skyline. The amber bourbon in my crystal glass catches the city lights as I look down at the streets below. Everything looks so peaceful and quiet from up here. The soft jazz playing in the background is a stark contrast to the chaos from just 3 days ago. 3 days ago, my reality was a meticulously orchestrated nightmare designed to break my spirit and strip me of everything I had built. My mother-in-law Vivian is 62 years old and prides herself on coming from old generational wealth. She wears her family name like a heavy crown, demanding that everyone around her bow down to her perceived superiority. To the outside world, she is a pillar of the black elite in Atlanta, hosting charity galas and wearing designer suits. But that crown is rusted, and her wealth is a complete illusion. It is a fragile facade of mounting debt and unpaid credit lines that I have been quietly funding for years. The betrayal happened on a desolate stretch of highway 40 miles outside the city limits. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Vivian had insisted on driving me out there under the guise of viewing a piece of commercial real estate. She claimed it was a perfect investment for my portfolio and that she wanted to do something nice for me. I should have known better. There was no property tour. The storm hit suddenly, cracking the sky open and unleashing a blinding sheet of freezing rain. It instantly soaked right through my designer coat. I had stepped out of the vehicle because she claimed she heard a strange noise coming from the rear tires and asked me to check. The second my boots hit the wet pavement, I heard the heavy metallic thud of the locks engaging. I stood on the muddy shoulder of the road, shivering as the wind whipped my wet hair across my face. Vivian sat comfortably inside her heated Lexus. The engine hummed softly. She rolled down the passenger window just a few inches, letting out a blast of warm air that felt like a deliberate, cruel taunt. She did not look at me with a shred of concern or motherly affection. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. Without a single word of explanation, she shoved the documents through the narrow gap in the window. The papers fluttered down and landed directly in a puddle of thick brown mud right at my feet. "Pick it up and sign it," Zariah Vivian demanded, her voice cutting sharply through the loud sound of the pouring rain. Her tone was completely devoid of any human warmth. I stared down at the ruined documents. The bold letters at the top clearly read Asset Transfer Agreement. I looked back up at her perfectly manicured face. I asked her what this was about, even though I already knew the ugly truth deep down. "Marcus needs capital immediately," she snapped, referring to my husband, her precious 34-year-old son. Marcus is a vice president at a major investment bank, a title he parades around the city to maintain his polished, untouchable image. But behind closed doors, he is a coward drowning in reckless debt. His latest vanity project, a massive hedge fund venture, was collapsing rapidly due to his own arrogance and sheer incompetence. "Sign the transfer," Vivian ordered, pointing a manicured finger at the mud. "You will sign over the deed to your security firm and authorize the liquidation of your private stock portfolio to cover my son's margin calls. It is the absolute least you can do for this family. We gave you our prestigious name. We elevated you out of the gutter." I stood in the freezing rainwater, pouring down my face, and stared at the woman who had made it her life mission to belittle me since the very first day Marcus introduced us. I built my crisis management firm from absolutely nothing. I worked grueling night shifts as a security guard to pay my tuition at Spelman College. I built a massive empire with my own two hands analyzing risks and protecting the elite while she spent her days sipping champagne at the country club on borrowed money. I am not signing away my life to pay for your son's mistakes, I said clearly, making sure my voice carried over the raging storm. I am not your savior, and I am certainly not your fool. Vivian's face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. She absolutely hated the fact that a woman from a working-class neighborhood had surpassed her golden child. She hated that I did not need her money, her social connections, or her approval to succeed. "You arrogant little brat," she hissed. "You think because you have a fancy title and a few dollars you are suddenly our equal. You are nothing without the Vance name. You come from the dirt, Zariah, and you will always be dirt. You are going to stand out there in this freezing rain until you learn your proper place in the hierarchy of this family. When you are ready to be a dutiful wife and sign those papers to save your husband from financial ruin, you can call me. Until then, enjoy the storm." She rolled the window up seamlessly, cutting off the warm air. I did not scream. I did not bang my fists on the glass. I did not cry. I simply stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight, despite the freezing wind tearing at my wet clothes. I looked directly into her dark eyes through the rain-streaked glass. I wanted her to see that she held absolutely no power over my emotions. I wanted her to memorize the unbothered, stone-cold look on my face. Vivian smirked at me. It was a cruel and triumphant smile. She was fully convinced she had just taught me a lesson I would never forget. She put the luxury car in drive, hit the gas pedal hard, and sped off down the empty highway. The heavy tires kicked up a massive wave of muddy water that splashed against my legs, leaving me entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. She fully expected me to break down in tears the moment she left. She expected me to pull out my phone, call her in a desperate panic, and beg for her mercy, while agreeing to surrender everything I had worked my entire life to build. She truly thought the harsh elements would strip away my pride and force me to submit to her will. I watched the red taillights of her Lexus fade into the thick gray fog until they completely disappeared. I did not run after her vehicle. I did not scream her name into the roaring wind. I simply turned around and walked with measured steps toward the rusted awning of an abandoned gas station a few yards away from the muddy shoulder of the highway. The structure was dilapidated with shattered glass covering the concrete and ancient fuel pumps standing like ghosts in the storm. But beneath that rotting metal roof, I was shielded from the worst of the freezing downpour. I stood there in the shadows, letting the cold water drip from my ruined designer coat. My physical vulnerability in that desolate place was undeniable, but my mind had never been sharper or more deadly calm. I raised my left arm and wiped the freezing rain from my face. I looked down at my wrist. My clothes were soaked through to the bone, but my custom Cartier watch was perfectly intact. I pressed my index finger against the small hidden button on the side of the diamond-encrusted dial and held it down for exactly 3 seconds. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration against my skin confirmed that the silent SOS signal had been activated. The encrypted distress beacon was now broadcasting my exact GPS coordinates directly to my private security team. They were the absolute best in the business, handpicked and trained by me. I knew it would not take them long to find me. While I waited in the cold darkness, I allowed my mind to completely dissect the rotten core of the Vance family. For years, Vivian and her children had paraded around Atlanta acting like royalty. They threw lavish charity galas, drank vintage champagne, and looked down their noses at anyone who did not possess a trust fund or a pedigree. They loved to use the term generational wealth as a weapon to make others feel small and insignificant. But I knew the ugly truth. Their generational wealth was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on generations of massive debt. The grand Vance estate, with its manicured lawns and marble columns, was leveraged to the absolute limit. Vivian wore vintage Chanel suits, but her credit cards were routinely declined at private luncheons. They maintained their exclusive country club memberships by taking out predatory loans with exorbitant interest rates. They were bleeding cash every single day just to keep up the appearance of being untouchable. When I first met Marcus, I honestly believed he was different from the rest of his family. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed to possess a genuine drive to build his own legacy outside of his mother's suffocating shadow. I did not marry him for his money because I already had my own. I married him because I thought we were equal partners ready to build an empire together. But the mask slipped shortly after our wedding. I quickly realized that Marcus was not a driven entrepreneur. He was a terrified little boy, hiding behind expensive tailored suits and meaningless corporate titles. He lacked the discipline and the raw grit required to survive in the real business world. He was reckless, entitled, and hopelessly addicted to the thrill of high-stakes investments he did not actually understand. The irony of Vivian's grand speech in the car was almost laughable. She told me they had elevated me out of the gutter. She told me I owed them for the prestige of bearing the Vance name. The truth was exactly the opposite. For the past 2 years, I was the only person keeping their sinking ship afloat. When Marcus quietly lost $500,000 in a botched real estate deal, I was the one who quietly wired the funds to cover his tracks so he would not face federal fraud charges. When the bank threatened to foreclose on Vivian's beloved mansion, my holding company anonymously purchased the debt to stop the eviction. I protected them. I secured their secrets. I used my resources to build an invisible fortress around their fragile egos because I naively believed that was what family did for one another. But standing out here in the freezing storm, abandoned at an empty gas station because I finally refused to drain my own company to pay for another one of his catastrophic failures, my perspective shifted entirely. The love and loyalty I had harbored for Marcus evaporated into the cold air. The respect I had tried to force myself to feel for Vivian vanished. They did not see me as a daughter or a wife. They saw me as an endless ATM. They viewed my self-made success as a threat to their ego, yet they felt completely entitled to harvest the fruits of my labor. Vivian thought she was breaking me today. She thought stripping away my comfort and leaving me isolated in a dangerous place would finally put me in my place. She thought I would eventually crack, call her in a panic, and surrender my entire life savings just for the privilege of a warm ride home. She failed to realize that she had not broken my spirit. She had only broken the chains of obligation that tied me to her worthless family. I was no longer a dutiful daughter-in-law trying to win the approval of people who secretly despised me. I was the founder of a crisis management empire, and the Vance family had just become my latest target. I stood under the rusted awning, feeling the freezing wind cut through my wet clothes, but a warm sense of absolute clarity washed over me. I was going to dismantle their fake legacy piece by piece. I was going to let the bank take the house. I was going to let the creditors feast on their luxury cars. I was going to expose Marcus for the fraud he truly was. The howling wind was suddenly interrupted by the deep, aggressive roar of a massive engine approaching from the distance. The sound was distinct and powerful, cutting through the noise of the pouring rain. I looked up and saw a set of blinding high-intensity headlights pierce through the heavy gray fog. The massive vehicle was speeding down the desolate highway, ignoring the dangerous road conditions, and heading straight for the abandoned gas station where I stood waiting in the shadows. The blinding headlights cut through the heavy gray fog like twin blades. A massive vehicle emerged from the storm, its sleek black exterior repelling the freezing rain. It was a custom-armored Mercedes-Maybach, a fortress on wheels designed specifically for my personal protection. From a low angle, the imposing grille of the luxury vehicle looked almost predatory as it glided to a smooth and completely silent halt just inches from the edge of the rusted gas station awning. The heavy tires crushed the loose gravel beneath them, asserting complete dominance over the desolate environment. The storm raged all around it, but the Maybach stood completely unfazed. It was a mechanical beast answering the call of its master. The passenger side door opened with a heavy, satisfying metallic click that echoed through the empty lot. Malik stepped out into the freezing downpour. He was my lead personal bodyguard and my most trusted operative. A former special operations soldier who had seen combat in the harshest environments on Earth, Malik moved with a terrifying, calculated grace. He did not rush and he did not flinch when the icy rain hit his broad shoulders. He simply opened a massive black umbrella and stepped forward, creating a perfect shield against the violent weather. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that concealed his tactical gear, his expression stoic and completely unreadable. He walked over to where I stood, shivering in the shadows, positioning the umbrella over my head before I could feel another drop of water. He simply offered his arm and nodded toward the open door of the vehicle. I finally stepped out of the freezing cold, muddy reality of the abandoned gas station and climbed into the pristine, climate-controlled cabin of the Maybach. The heavy armored door slammed shut behind me, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the storm outside. The sudden silence in the cabin was profound and incredibly comforting. The interior smelled of rich leather and subtle cedar. I sank into the plush, heated rear seat, feeling the immediate relief as the advanced climate system began to dry my soaking wet clothes. A crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne was already waiting for me in the chilled center console. I picked it up, feeling the cool glass against my fingertips, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The crisp liquid burned slightly as it went down, warming my chest and sharpening my focus for the battle that was about to commence. Malik slid into the driver's seat and adjusted his earpiece. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his dark eyes entirely professional and sharp. He reached for the secure tablet mounted on the dashboard and pulled up the financial dossiers we had been compiling for months. He spoke in a low, even tone that commanded complete attention. "Madam," he began respectfully, his deep voice cutting through the incredibly quiet cabin. "The target assets are completely locked in our crosshairs. We have successfully traced every hidden bank account, every offshore shell company, and every heavily leveraged credit line associated with Vivian Vance and her immediate family members. Their financial structure is incredibly fragile. They are currently functioning on a negative cash flow, relying entirely on the phantom equity of their primary estate to secure new loans. If we pull the primary support pillars tonight, the entire Vance family portfolio will collapse before the stock market opens on Monday morning. We hold the majority of their bad debt. You are the sole creditor, standing between them and total financial ruin." I took another sip of the champagne, letting the sweet taste linger on my tongue. The Vance family thought they were playing a game of social chess, but they had absolutely no idea I owned the entire board. They believed my wealth was just a cute little side project, an agency I ran to keep myself busy while Marcus handled the real business. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. "Take us back to the city, Malik," I ordered, my voice steady and cold. "But do not take me back to my penthouse, and do not take me to the Vance estate." Malik raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting for the destination. "We are heading straight to the Biltmore Country Club," I commanded. The Biltmore Country Club was the absolute pinnacle of high society in Atlanta. It was an exclusive, heavily guarded fortress of privilege where the black elite gathered to flaunt their wealth and secure their social standing. Tonight, Vivian was hosting a massive, incredibly expensive birthday gala for her wealthy friends in the main ballroom. It was a highly anticipated event, designed specifically to showcase the Vance family legacy and project an image of untouchable prosperity to the rest of the city. Vivian had deliberately planned to leave me stranded in the rain, so I would miss the gala, allowing her to control the narrative and explain my absence by claiming I lacked the class to attend such a prestigious gathering. She wanted to humiliate me by erasing me from the family portrait entirely. She wanted a show, I whispered to myself, swirling the champagne in my glass. So I am going to give her a spectacular one. I am going to crash her perfect little party and tear her fake empire to the ground in front of everyone she desperately wants to impress. Understood, Malik replied immediately. He shifted the Maybach into gear and the massive engine roared to life. As the armored vehicle pulled away from the gas station, leaving the mud and the shadows behind us, speeding aggressively toward the city, Malik tapped a final command on his secure tablet. I watched the screen mounted between the front seats. The detailed financial graphs suddenly vanished. The screen went completely black for a split second before flashing a bright glowing red notification. The bold text illuminated the dark cabin. It clearly read, "Asset Seizure Protocol, ready to activate, awaiting your final confirmation." I stared at the glowing red text on the screen for a brief moment before giving Malik a firm nod. He tapped the confirmation button, sending the encrypted command through our secure servers. The massive Maybach accelerated through the wet streets of Atlanta, weaving seamlessly through the evening traffic until the grand illuminated gates of the Biltmore Country Club finally came into view. The sprawling estate was a monument to old money and exclusive privilege. Towering oak trees lined the perfectly manicured driveway, and a fleet of luxury vehicles was already parked out front, attended by valets in crisp white uniforms. Malik pulled the armored vehicle directly up to the main entrance, completely ignoring the designated drop-off zones. The valets rushed forward, but Malik was already out of the driver's seat. He opened my door with his signature calculated precision, holding the large black umbrella to shield me as I stepped out into the damp night air. My expensive designer dress clung heavily to my skin, soaked from the storm. My hair, usually styled in flawless perfection, was damp and wild. I looked nothing like the polished, untouchable crisis manager the city knew. I looked like a woman who had just walked through a hurricane. But as I stepped onto the plush crimson carpet of the country club entrance, I did not try to smooth my dress or hide my disheveled state. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, radiating an absolute and terrifying authority. The lobby staff, usually strict about the club's archaic dress codes, froze in their tracks. They recognized me immediately. They saw the cold fire in my eyes and the heavily armed presence of Malik standing right behind me. No one dared to say a single word. No one asked for my invitation. I walked past the concierge desk without breaking my stride, my wet heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I moved down the long, opulent hallway leading to the main ballroom. The walls were lined with expensive oil paintings and ornate gold sconces that cast a warm glow. It was a stark contrast to the freezing reality I had just endured on the side of that desolate highway. I could hear the muffled sounds of a live jazz band playing a smooth tempo. The faint clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of arrogant laughter echoed down the corridor. This was Vivian's world. This was the sanctuary where she felt completely untouchable, surrounded by her enablers. We reached the intricately carved wooden doors of the main ballroom. I stopped for a fraction of a second, taking one deep breath to center my focus. I did not need to give Malik a verbal command. He stepped forward, placed his large hands on the heavy brass handles, and pushed the grand doors wide open with a sudden, violent force. The heavy doors swung outward, hitting the interior walls with a loud, resounding thud that immediately cut through the music. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking display of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, illuminating hundreds of guests in their finest evening wear. Waiters navigated the crowded floor carrying silver trays of expensive vintage champagne. Standing right in the center of the room, holding court like a reigning queen, was my mother-in-law. Vivian was wearing a stunning emerald green gown, a diamond necklace sparkling brightly against her skin. She had a captive audience of Atlanta's most influential socialites hanging on to her every word. She took a delicate sip from her champagne flute, her face twisted into a mask of fake sympathy. I could hear her voice carrying clearly over the sudden hush that was beginning to ripple through the back of the room. "It is such a shame," Vivian said, shaking her head dramatically. "I practically begged Zaria to stay and celebrate with us tonight. But you know how she is. She lacks the basic class and refinement required for events like this. She felt completely out of place and embarrassingly insisted on leaving early." Her wealthy friends murmured in agreement, shaking their heads in mock pity. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the subject of their cruel gossip was standing right behind them. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing, the musicians lowering their instruments as they noticed the commotion at the entrance. A heavy silence swept across the massive ballroom like a shock wave. The crowd slowly parted, stepping aside to create a wide, clear path leading directly from the doorway to the center of the room where Vivian stood. I walked down that newly formed aisle, my wet heels leaving distinct footprints on the pristine white marble floor. Malik followed closely, his imposing figure casting a long, dark shadow over the terrified guests. Her audience turned around, their eyes widening in shock as they took in my wet dress and the lethal expression on my face. Vivian stopped speaking. She turned around, clearly annoyed by the interruption, only to find me standing 10 feet away. The crystal champagne flute in her hand began to tremble violently. The smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from her perfectly manicured face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained entirely from her cheeks, leaving her completely pale. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or throw a dramatic tantrum. I looked her dead in the eyes, a chilling smile forming on my lips. "You are right about one thing, Vivian," I said, my voice echoing through the dead-silent ballroom. "Money certainly cannot buy true elegance, but it can buy a bankrupt family a few extra hours of fake prestige. I did not leave your party early. I missed the appetizers because you drove me 40 miles out of the city and abandoned me in a freezing rainstorm. You deliberately left me stranded to suffer on the side of an empty highway, fully expecting me to beg for your mercy like a child." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted nervously around the room as she realized her carefully constructed lie had just been obliterated in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. She clutched her diamond necklace, stepping back as if my words had physically struck her. Before she could formulate a pathetic excuse to save face, a figure detached himself from the crowd and stepped directly into the clearing between us. It was Preston. He was 35 years old, white, and married to my spoiled sister-in-law, Chloe. Preston was the quintessential Wall Street finance bro, wearing a bespoke navy blue suit. He carried himself with an unearned, suffocating arrogance, always looking down his nose at anyone who did not share his pedigree or his skin color. He had married into the Vance family because he desperately wanted the social clout that came with their historic name. He buttoned his suit jacket with a smug, self-righteous smirk, stepping squarely in front of Vivian to play the valiant protector. "Zariah, please," Preston said, his voice dripping with forced patience and condescension. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Let us turn the temperature down a bit, shall we? You are clearly highly emotional right now. Vivian merely made a minor navigational error in the storm, and you are blowing a simple miscommunication wildly out of proportion. There is absolutely no need for this ridiculous theatrical display. Look at yourself. You are completely drenched and making an absolute scene in front of the entire country club. We expect a certain level of decorum here." He let out a short, mocking chuckle and shook his head, looking around the room to gather support from the wealthy onlookers. "Honestly, Zariah, I know you run that cute little security agency of yours, and perhaps in your line of work, dramatic confrontations are the norm. But in the real world of high finance and elite society, we resolve our minor grievances with grace and maturity. You are not protecting a local celebrity from the paparazzi right now. You are standing in a room full of genuine power players, and your behavior is entirely unacceptable." He took another step closer to me, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimately threatening, though it still carried across the silent ballroom. "Do you have any idea how hard the people in this room have worked to build their legacies?" He continued, his tone dripping with a sickening white savior complex. "You are actively embarrassing the black folks in this room who spent decades earning their rightful place at this table. You are giving them a bad name with this loud, aggressive ghetto routine. You need to apologize to your mother-in-law, quietly walk out those doors and go home before you ruin your own reputation completely. He puffed out his chest, his pale face flushing with the thrill of his perceived dominance. You see, Zariah, some of us understand how the world operates. At the Avalon Fund, where I serve as a senior director, we deal in billions, not the pennies your little guard dog company scrapes together. We move global markets. We manage the portfolios of actual titans. I sit at tables you could not even buy your way into. When I tell you that you are making a catastrophic mistake by attacking the Vance matriarch tonight, I suggest you shut your mouth and listen to me. I stood there feeling the cold, wet fabric of my ruined dress clinging to my skin and listened to this mediocre, deeply insecure man attempt to lecture me about wealth and power. It was almost poetic in its absurdity. Preston was the ultimate fraud, a man who built his entire identity on a job title and a marriage certificate. When he married Chloe, he thought he was integrating himself into black royalty. He loved dropping the Vance name at his corporate retreats to prove how diverse and socially connected he was. He truly believed he was the smartest person in any room, simply because society had always handed him a microphone and told him his voice mattered most. He had absolutely no idea that his prestigious Avalon Fund was currently bleeding capital, or that the very family he was defending was secretly drowning in debt that I exclusively controlled. He thought my company was just a boutique security firm providing bouncers for rich kids. He did not know that my firm specialized in corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, and financial crisis management. He did not know I had spent the last 48 hours systematically dismantling his reality. He finished his arrogant little speech and stood there with his arms crossed, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He fully expected me to shrink back, humiliated by his public reprimand. He expected me to realize my supposed place in his manufactured hierarchy and retreat into the stormy night. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if the self-proclaimed finance king had successfully tamed the wild, angry daughter-in-law. I did not scream. I did not defend my company or my character. I did not even grant him the respect of a verbal response. Instead, I maintained a look of utter chilling indifference. I slowly turned my head slightly to the left, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Preston's suddenly faltering gaze. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound echoed loudly like a gunshot in the silent room. Malik immediately stepped forward from the dark shadows, his face completely expressionless, and produced a pristine, neatly folded white silk handkerchief. He handed it directly to me. I slowly took the handkerchief, preparing to wipe the floor with the arrogant little man standing right in front of me. I unfolded the crisp white silk handkerchief with deliberate slowness. The entire ballroom seemed to fade away around me, the glittering chandeliers and the shocked faces of the elite guests dissolving into a blurred, insignificant background. My focus was razor-sharp, zeroing in entirely on Preston's pale face. A cold, confident smirk crept onto my lips. I meticulously wiped the rainwater from my hands, pressing the soft silk against my palms with the relaxed elegance of a queen preparing to execute a traitor. The silence in the room was absolute, so heavy and dense that I could hear the panicked, uneven rhythm of Preston's breathing. He stood there, his previously puffed-out chest slowly deflating as the primal realization of danger began to wash over him. He had expected me to yell. He had expected me to throw a defensive tantrum that would validate his racist, classist assumptions about who I was and how I operated. My total silence was short-circuiting his arrogant brain. I finished drying my hands and gracefully handed the damp silk back to Malik without even glancing in his direction. I took one slow step forward, completely invading Preston's personal space. He flinched, his polished leather shoes scraping against the marble floor as his body instinctually urged him to retreat. I tilted my head slightly, my eyes boring directly into his terrified soul. Transaction ID: Alpha 7, 49er, Delta 32, Bravo. I stated, my voice echoing through the space with chilling clarity. I spoke the alphanumeric sequence, slowly enunciating every single syllable so the words would carve themselves into his memory. Transaction ID: Alpha 749er, Delta 32. Bravo. I repeated, watching the initial confusion wash over his face. Does that specific sequence mean anything to you, Preston? I know you like to brag about your unparalleled financial acumen, so I sincerely hope you pay attention to the major movements occurring within your own supposedly impenetrable organization. Preston blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He shook his head, a nervous bead of sweat forming right at his hairline despite the cool temperature of the opulent ballroom. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, his previously authoritative Wall Street voice reducing to a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. You are just spouting random nonsense to distract everyone from the fact that you do not belong here. I let out a soft, dark laugh that made Vivian flinch in the background. It is not nonsense, Preston, I corrected him gently, like a teacher correcting a slow child. That specific sequence is the official federal confirmation code for a highly classified corporate acquisition finalized at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. It is the exact moment my cute little security agency executed a massive leveraged buyout, purchasing a 15% controlling ownership stake in the Avalon Fund. The color completely drained from Preston's face. He looked as though I had just reached into his chest and physically ripped out his heart. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding crowd of wealthy onlookers as the sheer magnitude of my statement registered in their minds. The Avalon Fund was a financial behemoth, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm that supposedly dictated the flow of global markets, and I had just publicly announced that I owned a massive controlling piece of it. Yes, Preston. I continued, my smirk widening into a victorious, predatory smile. While you were busy picking out your custom-tailored suit for this ridiculous party, my legal team was busy restructuring your entire corporate hierarchy. My boutique agency is no longer just a security firm. We are a diversified holding company, and as of this morning, we are the single largest voting shareholder at the Avalon Fund. By every legal and corporate metric, I am now your ultimate boss. I took another step forward, forcing him to stumble backward to avoid touching my wet dress. He was trembling violently now, his hands shaking so hard he had to tuck them into his pockets to hide his fear. You like to talk about power, Preston, I whispered, leaning in so my words would pierce his fragile ego. You like to stand in rooms full of black people and lecture us about decorum. You love to hide behind your fancy title and pretend you are untouchable. But your title belongs to me now. Your corner office, your six-figure bonuses, your stock options, and your entire pathetic career rest entirely in the palm of my hand. If I decide you are underperforming, you are gone. If I do not like your tie, you are gone. I absolutely despise your arrogant tone, so I strongly suggest you shut your mouth, step aside, and lower your eyes when you speak to me, unless you want your immediate termination papers faxed before midnight. Preston looked shattered. The arrogant finance bro facade had been pulverized, leaving behind a terrified, trembling shell of a man. He could not find the courage to utter a single syllable of protest. He physically folded in on himself, stepping out of my path with his head bowed, thoroughly humiliated in front of the elite society he desperately wanted to impress. The room remained paralyzed in absolute shock. But the silence was abruptly shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. It was Chloe. My 30-year-old spoiled sister-in-law could not handle the sight of her perfect white husband being publicly emasculated by the woman she always considered beneath her. She wore a bright pink gown that looked ridiculous as she pushed through the paralyzed spectators. Her face was flushed dark red with pure rage. "How dare you talk to my husband like that?" Chloe screamed, abandoning the country club decorum Preston had just preached about. She lunged forward with her hands raised, her manicured acrylic nails aimed directly at my face, like claws completely blinded by her unhinged fury and desperate need to protect her collapsing world. before Chloe's manicured hands could even come close to my face. Malik stepped seamlessly into her path. He did not strike her. He simply raised his massive arm and caught her by the wrist with the effortless precision of a man swatting away a minor annoyance. Chloe shrieked in shock as her forward momentum came to a sudden jarring halt. She thrashed wildly against his iron grip, but Malik stood as still and unmovable as a concrete statue. His face remained completely devoid of emotion as he held the screaming woman suspended in her own ridiculous rage. The elite guests murmured in horror, stepping further back to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. That was when the crowd parted for a second time, and my husband finally made his grand entrance. Marcus Vance was 34 years old and wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's vehicles. He frantically pushed through the paralyzed onlookers. He had been mingling near the open bar, completely oblivious to the massacre happening in the center of the ballroom, until the music stopped and his sister's screaming echoed through the hall. He rushed over to the scene, his perfectly polished leather shoes sliding slightly on the marble floor. I looked at the man I had married, waiting to see a flicker of concern in his eyes. I was standing in the middle of a freezing ballroom, wearing a soaking wet dress with my hair plastered to my face. Any normal husband would have immediately taken off his jacket, wrapped it around his freezing wife, and demanded to know who had done this to her. But Marcus was not a normal husband. He was a coward playing dress-up in a rich man's world. He stopped right next to his trembling mother and looked directly at me. His eyes darted nervously from my ruined dress to Malik's imposing figure holding his sister, and finally to Preston, who was still staring at the floor in absolute defeat. Marcus did not ask me if I was all right. He did not ask me how I ended up completely drenched in the middle of his mother's birthday gala. He only saw the immediate threat I posed to his carefully curated social image. "Zariah, what in the world are you doing?" He hissed, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of anger and deep-seated fear. "Tell your giant guard dog to release my sister right this second and call him off. You are humiliating us in front of the entire city. Have you completely lost your mind tonight?" I gestured for Malik to release Chloe. Malik let go of her wrist and she stumbled backward into Preston's arms, sobbing hysterically. Marcus ran a trembling hand over his perfectly styled hair, trying desperately to regain control of a situation he fundamentally did not understand. "You need to fix this, Zariah," he demanded, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "You are going to turn around, apologize to Preston for whatever crazy lies you just yelled at him, apologize to my mother for ruining her birthday gala, and then we are going to step into a private room. You are acting completely unhinged, and you are making me look like an absolute fool in front of my colleagues. High-ranking executives from my bank are in this room right now, Zariah. Do you have any idea what this kind of ghetto spectacle does to my professional reputation?" I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. I took a step forward, creating a tense physical standoff. Our eyes locked in a rapid exchange of unyielding fury and desperate cowardice. Over his shoulder, I could clearly see the terrified elite guests holding their collective breath. His gaze shifted violently over my shoulder toward Malik, calculating the physical threat before darting back to my face. Marcus took a rigid step toward me, trying to assert his dominance in front of his wealthy peers, but his trembling hands betrayed his true, overwhelming fear. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive tuxedo jacket and pulled out a freshly printed copy of the exact same asset transfer agreement Vivian had thrown into the mud hours ago. They had planned this perfectly. If Vivian failed to break me in the storm, Marcus was supposed to ambush me at the party and force my hand under the immense social pressure of their friends. He shoved the paperwork aggressively toward me. "You are going to sign the power of attorney right now, Zariah," he ordered, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to sound authoritative. "You are going to sign these papers and authorize the transfer of your firm to save this family from a temporary cash flow issue. We are the Vances. We gave you everything. If you do not sign this right now and save our family, I will file for divorce first thing Monday morning. I will hire the most vicious lawyers in Atlanta, take half of everything you own, and leave you with absolutely nothing. You will be right back in the gutter where we found you." I stood there letting the sheer audacity of his threat wash over me. I looked over his shoulder at the terrified faces of the Vance family members, and then focused back on the pathetic man I used to love. The absolute delusion was staggering. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the heavy tension like a razor blade. I stepped forward again, closing the distance between us until we were inches apart, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I did not flinch. "Save the family!" I asked, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper that still somehow echoed clearly across the silent room. "Are you actually trying to save the family, Marcus? Or are you just desperately trying to save the massive crypto debt hole you dug yourself into?" Marcus flinched as if I had struck him across the face. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic. He tried to maintain his composed posture, but his shoulders slumped, and a thick bead of sweat formed at his temple, rolling slowly down the side of his face. He shook his head aggressively, looking around the room at the silent, judgmental eyes of the elite guests. "I do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, his voice cracking in a way that shattered his polished Wall Street persona. "You are completely delusional, Zariah. There is no debt hole. I am a vice president at a major investment bank. I manage hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. You are standing in front of my colleagues and my family spewing absolute garbage just because you are angry my mother made a mistake with the driving directions." He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that echoed awkwardly in the dead, silent ballroom. "Look at yourself," he continued, pointing at my wet clothes. "You are hysterical. You need psychological help." Vivian immediately stepped forward to shield her golden boy. She placed a manicured hand on his arm and glared at me with pure venom. "How dare you accuse my son of such absolute nonsense?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Marcus is a brilliant financial mind. He has built a pristine reputation in this city. He is the pride of the Vance family. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman trying to drag him down to your pathetic level because you know you could never achieve his level of prestige. You come into my birthday gala looking like a drowned rat, making wild accusations because you want attention. We are done playing these games with you, Zariah. If you will not sign those documents to help with a simple temporary liquidity issue, then we will simply freeze your accounts and take what is rightfully ours through the courts. You are legally bound to this family, and we will not let you ruin my son's immaculate name with your filthy lies." I let her finish her desperate little speech. I did not interrupt her because I wanted everyone in the room to hear exactly how blindly she protected a criminal. I looked at Marcus, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. The heavy reality of his crimes was rapidly crashing down on his shoulders. He was trapped, and he knew it. I raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers one single time. The sound was sharp and commanding, cutting through the heavy tension of the opulent space. Malik immediately stepped forward from the dark shadows carrying a thick, heavy leather binder. He walked deliberately to the nearest linen-draped cocktail table, sweeping a silver tray of expensive champagne glasses completely out of the way. The fine crystal shattered loudly against the polished marble floor, sending sharp shards scattering everywhere, but nobody in the terrified crowd dared to move or make a single sound. Malik slammed the heavy binder down onto the table with tremendous force and flipped it open, exposing hundreds of pages of highlighted financial records, bank statements, and wire transfer receipts. I stepped toward the table and looked directly at the crowd of wealthy onlookers, making sure my voice was loud enough for every single person in the ballroom to hear the absolute, undeniable truth. "My husband is not a brilliant financial mind," I announced, my voice ringing with cold, hard, unbreakable authority. "My husband is a desperate, reckless thief who just committed massive federal wire fraud. Last month, Marcus finally realized his highly leveraged hedge fund venture was completely collapsing. Instead of acting like a mature man and facing his professional failures, he decided to steal directly from the one person who had been secretly funding his fake, luxurious lifestyle for years. I reached down and picked up the top document from the heavy binder, holding it high into the air for the entire room to clearly see. This is a forged corporate authorization form bearing my illegally copied signature. Marcus used this exact document to deliberately bypass my advanced corporate security protocols and illegally withdraw $3 million in liquid cash directly from my private corporate holding company. He immediately wired that stolen money to an untraceable offshore shell account located in the Bahamas, hoping to dump the stolen funds into a highly volatile, fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme just to magically erase his massive hidden debts. He truly thought because we were legally married, I would blindly trust him and never actively audit the internal corporate accounts or look closely at the outgoing routing numbers. But he completely forgot one vital detail about the woman he married. I literally run a corporate security and elite crisis management empire. I track hidden financial anomalies and destroy sophisticated corporate espionage threats for a living. Catching a sloppy, desperate amateur thief like Marcus was effortlessly simple. The entire beautiful ballroom erupted in a collective, horrified gasp. The elite crowd instinctively recoiled, stepping away and staring at Marcus, as if he were a dangerously diseased animal that had suddenly wandered into their exclusive gathering. The polished, invincible husband facade was entirely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He could not look at his mother. He could not look at his colleagues. The silence that followed the initial gasp was heavy. Everyone in the room finally realized the horrible truth about the Vance family legacy. They were nothing but criminals hiding behind stolen money and filthy lies. Marcus stood completely paralyzed with overwhelming fear, unable to speak, unable to run, his wide eyes filled with absolute sheer terror as his entire fake wealthy world finally burned permanently to the ground right before him. The silence in the ballroom was suddenly broken by the frantic, chaotic shuffling of the Vance family. Marcus stumbled backward, bumping hard into Preston. Preston grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, his own face still chalk-white from the realization that his career was now effectively over. Vivian immediately rushed to her son's side, her emerald green gown swishing violently across the marble floor. They clustered together in a tight, defensive triangle. The air in the grand ballroom grew heavy and suffocating as the desperate trio fully realized the massive scale of my ambush. The scene was pure cinematic chaos. A rapid shift back and forth between their faces captured the raw, unfiltered panic, mutating into cornered aggression. Marcus was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his ruined tuxedo. Preston was muttering frantic curses under his breath, looking wildly around the room for an escape route that did not exist. But Vivian felt a completely different, intense emotion. The shock that had initially paralyzed her was rapidly boiling over into an uncontrollable volcanic rage. She could not accept that a woman she viewed as inferior was publicly executing her family. She absolutely refused to surrender her imaginary crown. Her manicured hands curled into tight fists, her diamond rings digging painfully into her own palms. The poised matriarch of the Vance family evaporated, leaving behind a vicious predator fighting for social survival. Vivian took a step forward, shielding her criminal son behind her back. "You think you have won?" she screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the crystal chandeliers above. "You think you can waltz into my country club wearing a soaking wet dress, throw a few forged documents on a table, and destroy my family? You are out of your mind, Zariah. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. We are the Vance family. We built this city. Our legacy is woven into the very fabric of Atlanta elite society. My grandfather laid the foundation for the institutions these people rely on every single day. We sit on the boards of the most prestigious charities, banks, and hospitals in this state. You are nothing but a temporary blip in our history. You are a street-smart girl who got incredibly lucky, And now you are letting your inflated ego write checks your bank account cannot possibly cash. She was shaking with sheer fury, completely abandoning the graceful country club etiquette she had preached about all evening. Her wealthy friends watched in stunned silence as the mask of their favorite socialite violently tore apart, revealing the ugly, desperate truth underneath. She took a deep breath, preparing to launch a verbal assault meant to tear my confidence to shreds and re-establish her dominance. "You want to play hardball with me?" Vivian yelled, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. "I will show you what real power looks like in this city. I will make a dozen phone calls tonight. I know the mayor. I know the governor. I know the chief executive officers of every major corporation that currently employs your pathetic little security firm. By tomorrow morning, every single one of your elite contracts will be permanently canceled. I will personally ensure your corporate licenses are revoked immediately. I will have you blacklisted from every country club, every charity gala, and every high society function in the entire Southeast. No one will ever hire you again. No one will even look in your direction without feeling absolute disgust. I will bankrupt your little agency so fast your head will spin, and then I will use the Vance legal team to bury you under so many defamation lawsuits you will be paying my family damages for the rest of your miserable life." Preston, desperate to salvage his own sinking ship, leaned forward and nodded aggressively. "She is right, Zariah," he chimed in, his voice wavering but desperately trying to sound intimidating. "You cannot just execute a hostile takeover of a massive fund like Avalon without facing immediate regulatory backlash. I will call the board of directors. I will have your shares frozen pending a federal investigation. We will completely destroy you by Monday morning. You messed with the wrong people." He adjusted his tie, trying to project a false sense of confidence, but his body was trembling uncontrollably under the bright lights. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, panting and sweating, throwing every empty threat they could desperately conjure. They believed that if they screamed loud enough, if they invoked the Vance legacy with enough venom, the reality of their destruction would somehow reverse itself. They expected me to flinch. They expected me to realize the sheer magnitude of the social and financial forces they were unleashing against me. They wanted me to bow my head, apologize for my insubordination, and beg for a truce before they annihilated my livelihood. I knew their threats were completely hollow. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical screaming. I did not even look at Marcus or Preston. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Vivian, watching the desperate, frantic rise and fall of her chest. I slowly adjusted the damp fabric of my dress and began to walk. I did not walk toward them. I walked right past them, forcing Vivian to step out of my way to avoid touching me. I moved deliberately toward the head of the main banquet table. Sitting right in the center, adorned with fresh orchids and ornate gold trim, was Vivian's designated VIP chair. It was the lavish, beautiful throne she had proudly planned to rule from all evening. I reached out, pulled the heavy, ornate velvet chair back, and smoothly sat down. I crossed my legs, rested my arms gracefully on the velvet armrests, and looked back at the three terrified villains standing in the middle of the ballroom. I had just permanently claimed her lavish throne, asserting total and absolute undeniable dominance over her entire fragile world. I settled into the plush velvet of the ornate chair, resting my hands gracefully on the carved armrests. It was incredibly comfortable, a fitting throne for the woman who secretly owned everything in this building. The sheer absurdity of their threats was almost entertaining. I looked at Vivian, whose chest was still heaving from her hysterical screaming, and then at Preston, who was desperately trying to look like a man in control of a situation that had already buried him. Finally, my eyes landed on Marcus, the man who promised to protect me, but instead threw me to the wolves. He was trembling so violently that the expensive fabric of his custom tuxedo was actually vibrating. "You really think a few angry phone calls to your country club friends will stop what is currently in motion?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm that forced everyone in the ballroom to lean in just to hear me. "You think the mayor or the governor cares about your rusted social crown when federal felonies are involved? You are operating under the delusion that we are having a social disagreement. We are not having a disagreement, Vivian. You are currently standing at ground zero of a meticulously calculated corporate execution. I shifted my gaze exclusively to my husband. Marcus, you have spent years pretending to be the smartest man in the room, I said, leaning back into the chair. But you made the most amateur mistake possible. You stole from a crisis management expert who built her entire career destroying people much smarter than you. Did you honestly believe I just discovered those forged documents this afternoon? Did you think I was sitting in the back of my Maybach frantically printing out bank statements on my way to this gala? I have known about your pathetic offshore accounts for exactly 3 days. The moment your unauthorized wire transfer hit the routing sequence, my internal security protocols flagged the transaction. Within 1 hour, my forensic accounting team had completely unraveled your entire offshore network, bypassing your pathetic encryption methods with absolute ease. They found the shell companies. They found the desperate crypto investments. They found the digital footprint connecting your work terminal directly to the forged signatures. And as a legally obligated corporate entity, I did exactly what my federal compliance licenses require me to do when I discover a massive financial crime. I handed every single piece of evidence over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation 72 hours ago. The collective gasp from the room was sharp and immediate, but it was quickly drowned out by a sudden harsh buzzing sound. An extreme close-up would have perfectly captured the moment his cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished surface of the nearby cocktail table. The bright screen illuminated the dark spilled champagne on the marble, flashing an urgent incoming call that demanded immediate attention from the absolute highest priority contact. The caller ID displayed the name of his senior defense attorney. Marcus stared down at the glowing device as if it were a live grenade completely ready to detonate. His breathing became incredibly erratic, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating panic. "Answer it, Marcus," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, terrified silence of the ballroom. "Answer the phone and put it on speaker so your mother and your arrogant brother-in-law can hear exactly what real power sounds like." Marcus could not move. His hands were shaking too violently to even reach for the device. Malik stepped forward, picked up the vibrating phone with effortless precision, swiped the screen to accept the call, and tapped the speaker button. He held the device out toward the center of the room. The frantic, breathless voice of his attorney echoed through the grand space, completely devoid of any professional composure. "Marcus, where are you?" the lawyer yelled over the line, the sound of chaotic shouting and heavy footsteps clearly audible in the background of the call. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not go back to the office. Do not attempt to access any of your secure banking terminals. The FBI just breached the main lobby of the investment bank. There are 24 federal agents here right now. They are executing a massive search warrant directly on your department. They are seizing your computer towers, your hard drives, and every single piece of physical paperwork in your suite. They have a federal judge's order to freeze all of your domestic and international assets, pending a massive wire fraud investigation. Do not speak to anyone. Get a car and come straight to my firm immediately. We need to prepare for a federal indictment." Malik ended the call, plunging the massive ballroom back into a suffocating, terrifying silence. The reality of the situation finally crushed the very last ounce of defiance out of the Vance family. Marcus physically broke down. His knees violently buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the hard marble floor. The polished, arrogant investment banker was completely gone, replaced by a sobbing, broken man, kneeling in the remnants of shattered crystal and spilled champagne. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, guttural wail that echoed pitifully against the high ceilings. Preston physically backed away from him, his eyes wide with sheer terror, desperate to distance himself from the toxic fallout. But Vivian completely lost her mind. The destruction of her golden child and the permanent annihilation of her fake empire pushed her over the edge of sanity. She lunged forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her hands clawed at the empty air as she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You are a devil," she shrieked, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. "You are an absolute devil, sent to destroy us all tonight, and I curse the day my son ever brought you into this family." Her hysterical shriek hung in the heavy air of the grand ballroom, refusing to dissipate. "You are an absolute devil," she screamed again, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her collapsing reality. "You are destroying a multi-million-dollar legacy. You are wiping out decades of prestige and honor just to satisfy your own petty, vindictive ego." I watched her completely unravel from the absolute comfort of her own lavish velvet chair. My posture remained perfectly relaxed, a stark contrast to the chaotic, frantic energy radiating from the three broken people standing before me. I slowly reached across the pristine white tablecloth and picked up a heavy crystal champagne bottle resting in a silver ice bucket. Condensation dripped down the cold green glass as I casually tilted it, pouring a fresh stream of expensive vintage champagne into an empty flute. The golden liquid bubbled and fizzed, the soft sound echoing loudly in the paralyzed room. I placed the bottle back into the ice bucket and picked up the delicate crystal glass. I looked at the frantic woman claiming I was destroying her historic multi-million-dollar empire, and for the first time all evening I let out a sound of pure, genuine amusement. I started to laugh. It was not a cruel, mocking chuckle or a forced, theatrical giggle. It was a deep, rich, spontaneous burst of genuine laughter that completely filled the massive ballroom. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors, striking Vivian like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She could not comprehend how anyone could find humor in the total destruction of the mighty Vance family. My laughter slowly subsided into a bright, chilling smile as I took a small, delicate sip of the cold champagne. The elite guests surrounding us stood frozen, holding their breath, their eyes darting back and forth between the weeping matriarch and the calm, unbothered woman sitting on her throne. They were waiting for my response, waiting for me to address the grand accusation that I was tearing down a legendary fortune. A multi-million-dollar legacy. I repeated, my voice laced with heavy sarcasm as I gently swirled the champagne in my glass. "Vivian, you are standing in a room full of the most powerful and intelligent financial minds in Atlanta. You are standing in front of doctors, lawyers, corporate executives, and real estate developers who actually built their wealth from the ground up through hard work and relentless dedication. Do you honestly believe you can still stand there and lie to their faces? Do you truly think anyone in this room still believes the ridiculous fairy tale of the invincible Vance family fortune? You do not have a legacy, Vivian. You have an incredibly expensive, highly curated theatrical production, and the final curtain has just officially dropped." I turned my attention away from her trembling face and shifted my gaze directly toward the pale, terrified man, desperately trying to blend into the background. Preston had been silently praying that the federal raid on Marcus would somehow distract me from his own precarious situation. He was standing near the edge of the cleared circle, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his broad shoulders hunched forward in a pathetic display of submission. He wanted nothing more than to disappear into the crowd and escape the radioactive fallout of his ruined in-laws. But I was not going to let the arrogant finance executive slip away into the night. I needed someone from the inside to completely validate my claims. I needed the ultimate symbol of their fake prestige to be the one who finally drove the final nail into their collective coffin. "Preston," I called out, my voice snapping like a whip across the silent room. "Step forward right now." He flinched violently, his eyes darting toward the exits before slowly, reluctantly meeting my intense gaze. He took one tiny, hesitant step forward, looking like a condemned prisoner approaching the execution block. His arrogant Wall Street swagger was completely gone, entirely replaced by the raw, naked fear of a man who suddenly realized he was completely expendable. I leaned forward in the velvet chair, resting my elbows on the thick wooden dining table, and interlaced my fingers. "You love to talk about high finance, Preston," I said. staring directly into his terrified soul. "You stood in front of this entire room just 10 minutes ago and proudly lectured me about your massive corporate influence. You bragged about the billions of dollars you supposedly manage at the Avalon Fund, and you tried to publicly humiliate me for running a tiny security agency." Preston swallowed hard, his throat moving incredibly nervously as he looked at the shattered remains of his family. He opened his mouth to apologize, but I immediately raised a single finger, completely silencing him before he could utter a single pathetic word. "I am your majority shareholder now, Preston," I reminded him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded absolute obedience. "I own the chair you sit in. I own the desk you work at. I own the massive annual bonuses you use to fund your country club memberships and your luxury car leases. I hold your entire professional future in the palm of my hand. So we are going to play a very simple game right now. You are going to earn your continued employment by providing a completely transparent public audit of your beloved in-laws." Vivian gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. She turned toward Preston, her eyes pleading desperately with him to remain silent. But I kept my eyes locked on the trembling finance executive. "Tell them exactly how this fake legacy is funded," I ordered. "Explain the unpayable interest rates." He looked at Vivian, shaking her head. He took a deep, shaky breath and slowly opened his mouth, ready to sell them all out completely. Preston stood paralyzed under the glaring crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. A rapid shift in visual focus would have captured the raw, undeniable tension passing between him and my mother-in-law. In the background, Vivian was shaking her head frantically, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea, begging him to protect the family's secret. But as the visual focus snapped sharply back to Preston's pale, terrified face, the instinct for pure self-preservation became painfully obvious. He was a finance executive who built his entire life on mitigating risk, and the Vance family was now a radioactive liability he could no longer afford to hold. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. "I am sorry, Vivian." He choked out, his voice trembling as he broke his gaze away from her horrified expression and looked directly out into the sea of wealthy guests. "I cannot go down for this. I cannot lose my career to protect a lie." He turned back to face me, his hands still shoved deep into his pockets. "The Vance family is completely broke, Zariah." He confessed, the words rushing out of his mouth like water from a broken dam. "They went entirely bankrupt exactly 5 years ago." The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening, but Preston did not stop talking. Now that the dam was completely broken, he poured every single ugly secret out onto the polished marble floor. "There is absolutely no generational wealth left," he continued, his voice growing slightly louder as the sheer adrenaline of his ultimate betrayal took over his senses. "The grand historic estate they live in is mortgaged to the absolute maximum limit. They have taken out third and fourth mortgages just to pay the basic property taxes. The luxury cars sitting out in the valet lot right now are all leased, and they are currently 3 full months behind on every single payment. And that famous exclusive black credit card Vivian loves to flash at exclusive charity luncheons is not backed by a massive trust fund. It is completely funded by a series of incredibly predatory, high-interest loans from dangerous shadow lenders. They are paying 25% interest just to buy ordinary groceries and designer dresses, so they can fiercely maintain the ridiculous illusion of being rich. Every single dime they have spent over the last half-decade is borrowed money they can never actually repay to anyone. They are financially drowning, Zariah, and they have been secretly using your corporate success as collateral to keep the aggressive creditors from foreclosing on their entire lives." The grand facade of the untouchable Vance legacy shattered completely, violently, and irreparably right before my very eyes. The elite members of Atlanta high society, the powerful people who had respected, feared, and envied Vivian for decades, stood in absolute stunned silence. Disgust and sheer disbelief rippled aggressively through the massive crowd as the prestigious guests finally realized they had been actively worshipping a family of desperate, pathetic frauds. Whispers immediately broke out, echoing across the massive room like a swarm of angry hornets. The affluent socialites who had just been cruelly laughing at my expense moments earlier were now glaring at Vivian with open, unhidden contempt. Vivian looked as though the solid floor had simply vanished beneath her expensive heels. Her horizontally focused, horrified expression was frozen permanently in place, her mouth slightly open but entirely incapable of forming any coherent words. The stunning emerald green designer gown she proudly wore suddenly looked like a cheap, discarded costume on a tragic aging actress whose highly anticipated play had just been violently cancelled mid-performance. Her entire fabricated identity, her established social dominance, her carefully constructed aristocratic reality had been completely obliterated by the exact same man she originally trusted to actively defend it. She heavily slumped against the sharp edge of the dining table, fiercely clutching the pristine white linen tablecloth, just to keep herself from physically collapsing onto the cold, hard floor. I remained comfortably seated in her velvet VIP chair, watching the absolute total destruction of their fake glittering empire with a cold, incredibly calculated satisfaction. Preston let out a long, heavy, shaky breath, aggressively wiping the cold, nervous sweat from his pale forehead, clearly believing his total submissive compliance had just miraculously saved his precious lucrative career at the Avalon Fund. But the arrogant white finance executive had completely forgotten about the highly explosive, unpredictable variable standing just a few feet away from his right side. Chloe had been staring directly at her husband in absolute horrifying shock, her shallow brain desperately struggling to process the devastating new reality that she was no longer a wealthy, privileged heiress. The sudden horrifying realization that she was entirely broke, and that the man she legally married had just completely publicly humiliated her family to selfishly save his own personal skin, finally snapped her fragile sanity strictly in half. She let out a piercing, guttural scream that completely drowned out the murmuring crowd. It was a terrifying sound of pure, unhinged fury and deep, catastrophic heartbreak mixed perfectly together. "You treacherous, backstabbing coward," Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, her face turning a bright, violent shade of deep crimson red. She lunged forward with terrifying, unexpected speed, completely bypassing Malik, and launched her entire body directly at Preston. Her manicured hands curled into tight, vicious claws, aiming straight for his terrified face. She collided heavily with his chest, sending them both crashing forcefully back into a silver tray of half-empty champagne glasses. She began physically attacking him, striking his chest and face with relentless, frantic blows, while screaming vicious curses that echoed loudly off the high ceilings, adding a perfect final layer of absolute chaotic humiliation to the absolute permanent ruin of the Vance family legacy. He threw his hands up in a desperate, pathetic attempt to protect himself from her wild, completely relentless physical assault on him. The chaotic scene in the center of the grand ballroom escalated into a humiliating public brawl. From a wide perspective, the sheer absurdity of the Vance family tearing each other apart was a tragic masterpiece. Chloe continued her relentless physical assault, her bright pink designer gown tearing slightly at the seam as she wildly swung her fists. She was blinded by her loss of status, violently taking out all of her desperate frustration on the man she had promised to love forever. Preston initially tried to merely deflect her blows, raising his forearms to shield his face from her sharp acrylic nails, but the sheer embarrassment of being beaten by his hysterical wife in front of Atlanta elite society finally snapped his remaining patience. He grabbed her forcefully by the wrists, his face red with exertion and anger, and violently shoved her backward. Chloe stumbled in her high heels, her arms flailing as she desperately tried to maintain her balance, before collapsing onto the marble floor right next to the shattered remains of the silver champagne tray. "Are you completely insane?" Preston roared, his voice cracking, as he aggressively wiped a thin trail of blood from a fresh scratch on his cheek. "Stop attacking me for telling the absolute truth. You want to be angry at someone for ruining your perfect little life tonight. Do not look at me. Go ask your sister-in-law. He extended his right arm, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at me as I sat perfectly still in the velvet VIP chair. Ask the woman you have spent the last 3 years treating like absolute garbage. You want to know who is really funding your lavish lifestyle. You want to know who paid the mortgage on your precious childhood home last month to stop the foreclosure. It was her. Zariah is the one holding all the cards. Her parent company quietly bought up every single piece of your family's bad debt. She is the sole creditor of this entire family. She owns your house. She owns your cars. She literally owns the ground you are crying on right now. The harsh words ripped through the massive ballroom like a shockwave. If the previous revelation of their bankruptcy had shattered their social standing, this new piece of information completely annihilated their fundamental reality. The affluent guests turned their heads in perfect unison, their shocked gazes snapping from the pathetic pile of the Vance family directly to me. The murmurs died down instantly, replaced by an awed, terrified silence. To the outside world, I was just the self-made woman who married into old money, a hard worker who occasionally funded a charity event. Now they suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of an absolute apex predator. I had not just married into the Vance family. I had methodically and legally conquered them. I had purchased their entire legacy out from under them, while sitting quietly at their Sunday dinners and enduring their endless condescending remarks. I had slowly built an invisible financial cage around them. Vivian let out a sharp, choked gasp, the terrifying sound echoing loudly in the dead, silent room. She clutched her chest with both hands, her diamond rings catching the bright light from the chandeliers above. Her face, already pale from the earlier humiliations, turned a horrifying shade of ashen gray. Her knees visibly buckled beneath her weight, and she stumbled backward, completely losing her balance. She crashed heavily into the thick wooden edge of the dining table, knocking over several incredibly expensive floral arrangements. Water and orchids spilled over the white linen, dripping onto the floor near her feet. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrified, desperate realization. Every single asset she had proudly bragged about all evening, every symbol of wealth she had consistently used to assert her social dominance over me, was now a lethal weapon I held directly against her throat. Her superiority was completely fabricated. My power was undeniable and absolute. I slowly stood up from the velvet chair, smoothing the damp fabric of my dress. I walked toward the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The crowd instinctively parted for me, their previous judgment replaced by undeniable fear and deep respect. I stopped a few feet away from Vivian, looking down at her trembling form. Preston is absolutely correct, I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive room. Every single loan, every mortgage, every massive line of credit that was keeping this family afloat was heavily bundled and sold off by your desperate shadow lenders. My holding company aggressively purchased the entire portfolio for pennies on the dollar. You thought you were so incredibly clever, Vivian. You thought you could constantly belittle me publicly, humiliate me, and then use your son to secretly drain my corporate accounts whenever your massive bills came due. You truly believed I was just a naive, grateful girl thrilled to bear your prestigious last name. You underestimated me at every turn. I took another step closer to her, lowering my voice so it carried a deeply intimate, terrifying threat. But I was never naive, and I was never grateful for a name built on lies. While you were busy planning country club galas and insulting my background, I was busy running full forensic audits on your entire life. That beautiful, historic mansion you love to show off in society magazines. The deed is sitting in a secure vault under my corporate name. Those imported luxury vehicles parked outside. My company holds the primary titles. Even the emerald necklace you are wearing right now, the one you proudly claim is a priceless family heirloom, was heavily collateralized 3 years ago. I hold the legal claim to that jewelry. You own absolutely nothing, Vivian. Your entire existence is a heavily subsidized lease, and as of tonight, I am permanently terminating your contract. I am foreclosing on your entire life. A high-angle perspective looking down at the center of the grand ballroom would capture the exact moment Vivian Vance completely shattered. She was no longer the terrifying matriarch ruling over Atlanta society. From above, she looked incredibly small and utterly defeated as her trembling legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor, landing directly in a puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal. The heavy thud of her knees hitting the ground echoed through the silent room, signaling the absolute end of her reign. Her emerald green designer gown soaked up the spilled alcohol, ruining the expensive silk fabric, but she did not even seem to notice. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face, completely destroying her flawless, aristocratic image. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and the arrogant, vicious predator I had known for years instantly vanished. In her place was a desperate, pathetic woman frantically searching for any possible escape route from the absolute destruction she had brought upon herself. This sudden realization of her complete vulnerability hung heavily over the silent gathering. Everyone watched the mighty matriarch fall. The transformation was a jarring 180-degree flip that left the elite guests staring in sheer disbelief. Just moments ago, she was screaming at the top of her lungs, threatening to use her powerful social connections to permanently destroy my security firm and ruin my life. Now her face crumpled in absolute agony, and thick tears began streaming down her pale cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing desperately at the hem of my damp designer dress. "Zariah, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine that made my skin crawl. "Please do not do this to us. You cannot do this to your family. I am begging you from the absolute bottom of my heart. Please show us some mercy." She was crying so hysterically that her entire body shook violently, her diamond earrings catching the light as she bowed her head in total submission. It was an incredibly theatrical performance, but the raw, terrifying fear underneath her dramatic sobs was absolutely genuine. She knew her wealth was entirely gone. She knew her social standing was completely obliterated. The reality of her profound failure was entirely inescapable. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, desperately playing the ultimate victim card. "I am an old woman, Zaria," she cried, her voice echoing pitifully against the high ceilings of the country club. "I am a 62-year-old mother who was just trying to fiercely protect her only son. I made a terrible mistake today. I let my foolish pride and my blinding fear cloud my judgment, but you cannot punish me like this. You cannot take my home away and throw an elderly woman out onto the cold, unforgiving street. Where will I go? What will happen to Marcus? He is your husband. You loved him once. Please remember the good times we shared as a family." She tightened her grip on the fabric of my dress, her manicured nails digging into the damp material. "I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize to you right here in front of all my friends. I will step down from all my charity boards and give you my position. Just please do not foreclose on the estate. Please do not take everything I have left in this world. I have nothing else." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman clinging to my legs. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sympathy for her. The elite guests watching this pathetic spectacle looked entirely horrified, but no one stepped forward to help her. No one offered a comforting word or a hand to pull her up from the floor. They saw her exactly for what she truly was, a toxic, manipulative fraud who had finally met her match. She had spent years actively trying to make me feel small, isolating me, making me feel completely unworthy of her precious family name. She had deliberately driven me 40 miles out into a freezing rainstorm, locked her car doors, and abandoned me on the side of a dangerous highway, hoping the elements would break my spirit. She had laughed while I stood freezing in the mud, and now she expected me to suddenly feel compassion just because she was finally facing the severe consequences of her own horrific actions. Her fake apologies meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. The bridges were already completely burned to ashes. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed her wrists, peeling her trembling hands off my dress. I did not shove her away, but my tight iron grip was more than strong enough to let her quickly know that she had absolutely no power left. I slowly bent down, bringing my face level with hers. The smell of fear and spilled champagne radiated off her skin. Her sobbing momentarily stopped as she looked into my eyes, desperately searching for a tiny glimmer of hope or forgiveness. She truly believed her pathetic tears and her elderly mother routine had somehow touched my heart. She waited with bated breath for me to offer a compromise or a slight reprieve from her total financial ruin. She thought the bond of family would miraculously save her from the undeniable consequences of her lifelong cruelty. Instead, I leaned in even closer until my lips were just an inch away from her ear. I kept my voice incredibly low, a soft, lethal whisper meant entirely for her. "I do not want your public apologies, Vivian," I whispered, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. "I do not want your fake charity board seats or your pathetic tears. You fully sealed your own fate the exact moment you locked your car doors and drove away. I just want my Uber fare back from the rain." I straightened my posture and stepped back from the sobbing woman on the floor. Vivian stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing silently as the absolute finality of my words completely paralyzed her. She had nothing left to say and absolutely no leverage left to pull. The surrounding crowd of elite socialites remained frozen in a state of collective shock, completely unsure of how to react to the unprecedented destruction of a family they had worshipped for decades. The live jazz band had long since abandoned their instruments, and the only sound in the massive space was the pathetic, ragged breathing of my husband and my mother-in-law. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic pile of ruined silk and shattered crystal on the floor. I looked directly across the expansive room, past the terrified faces of the wealthy onlookers, and locked my eyes squarely on the towering, intricately carved wooden doors at the main entrance of the ballroom. A static camera shot pointing straight at those heavy doors would perfectly capture the exact moment the Vance family legacy was permanently sealed. The heavy silence in the country club was violently shattered by a loud, authoritative pounding. Before anyone in the room could even turn their heads to look, the massive double doors were forcefully pushed open from the outside. The heavy wood swung violently inward, slamming against the polished marble walls with a deafening crash that echoed like a bomb detonating inside the enclosed space. A large, highly coordinated team of federal law enforcement officers marched aggressively into the elegant ballroom. They were not local police officers making a polite inquiry. This was a joint task force consisting of heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, accompanied by a team of strict, unsmiling auditors from the Internal Revenue Service. They wore dark tactical pants, heavy combat boots, and stark gray windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs that proudly announced their federal authority. Their heavy footsteps hit the marble floor with synchronized military precision, completely destroying the delicate, refined atmosphere of the exclusive billionaire playground. The sudden, violent intrusion of federal agents sent a massive shockwave of pure panic tearing through the affluent guests. The elite members of Atlanta high society people, who routinely believed their wealth and status made them entirely immune to the harsh realities of the criminal justice system, completely lost their composure. They quickly scattered to the sides of the room like frightened animals fleeing a sudden predator. Beautiful designer gowns were carelessly dragged across the wet champagne-soaked floors, as the wealthy socialites desperately pushed each other out of the way to avoid standing anywhere near the path of the approaching agents. Several crystal glasses slipped from trembling hands, shattering loudly against the marble, as the guests scrambled backward, pressing their backs flat against the expensive wallpaper. No one wanted to be accidentally associated with the radioactive targets of a massive federal raid. The immense privilege they usually flaunted was instantly erased by the terrifying presence of federal badges and tactical gear. They whispered frantically to one another, their eyes wide with sheer horror, as they realized this was not a simple misunderstanding, but a highly organized, targeted takedown. The lead FBI agent, a tall, powerfully built man with a stern, uncompromising face, stepped through the grand entrance and immediately surveyed the chaotic scene. His sharp eyes quickly scanned the terrified crowd before locking directly onto the center of the room where the Vance family was gathered. He did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his hand, signaling his tactical team to fan out and secure the perimeter of the ballroom, effectively blocking every single exit. With his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt, he marched straight down the newly formed aisle created by the retreating guests. His heavy boots crushed the fallen orchid arrangements as he confidently approached the dining table. I took a deliberate step backward, smoothly, moving out of his direct path and allowing the federal authorities to officially take over the execution. Marcus, who was still kneeling helplessly on the floor next to his weeping mother, suddenly looked up. His tear-streaked face turned a sickly, translucent shade of white as he finally saw the gray windbreakers marching relentlessly toward him. He tried to scramble backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping uselessly against the wet marble, but his legs were completely devoid of any strength. The lead agent stopped exactly 3 feet away from my trembling husband. He looked down at the pathetic, ruined investment banker with an expression of absolute professional disgust. He reached into the inner pocket of his tactical windbreaker and pulled out a thick, folded legal document bearing the official seal of a federal judge. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, the silence so profound that the rustling of the heavy paper sounded incredibly loud. Marcus Vance, the lead agent, announced, his deep, authoritative voice, booming across the massive room and commanding absolute compliance. He did not ask a question. He delivered a terrifying, undeniable statement of fact. You are hereby placed under federal arrest. The agent forcefully snapped the document open and began reading the devastating charges aloud for every single elite guest to clearly hear. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe violations of federal banking regulations. We have a signed warrant to immediately seize your person, your communication devices, and all associated financial records. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it right now. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. Stand up and put your hands firmly behind your back, immediately. This is the absolute end of the line for your criminal activities. Do not make this any worse. Your entire financial network has been completely seized by the United States government. Stand up right now. Marcus could barely process the devastating commands echoing from the federal agent. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his downfall. The arrogant investment banker who had confidently threatened to divorce me just minutes ago was now a trembling mess on the marble floor. He tried to push himself up his expensive shoes, sliding uselessly against the soaked floor, but his muscles entirely refused to cooperate. He let out a loud sob like a terrified child. But Vivian could not help him. She was lying motionless just a few feet away, entirely defeated by the spectacular collapse of her fake empire. 2 armed agents stepped forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders and hauling him to his feet. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. The gleaming metal cut deeply into the cuffs of his custom-tailored tuxedo shirt, forever destroying the pristine image he had spent his entire life trying to project. He thrashed weakly against the grip of the federal agents, tears streaming aggressively down his face. "Please," Marcus sobbed, his voice cracking. "Please, there must be some mistake. I am a vice president. I can pay whatever fines are required. Please do not take me out there in front of everyone. Zarya, please tell them you authorized those transfers. Please save me." I stood perfectly still, watching him desperately beg for the salvation he had gleefully denied me, when I was standing freezing in the rain. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at him. The lead agent grabbed Marcus by the bicep forcefully, turning him toward the grand exit. You can save your excuses for the federal judge, the agent stated coldly, pushing the sobbing man forward. As Marcus was paraded through the parting crowd of horrified socialites, the tension in the room was pierced by another sharp sound. It was the loud ringing of a cell phone. The sound did not come from Marcus. It came from Preston. The arrogant finance executive who had been pressing himself against the wall trying to blend into the background and escape the crosshairs suddenly jumped. He fumbled frantically inside his tailored jacket pocket, pulling out his device. He stared down at the glowing screen, his face draining of whatever color it had left. The caller ID displayed a restricted government number. He swiped the screen and brought the device to his ear, his breathing incredibly shallow and erratic. "Yes, this is Preston," he whispered, his voice trembling with deep fear. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough to be faintly heard by those standing nearby, delivering a message of absolute professional destruction. Preston. I stepped forward, ensuring my voice cut cleanly through his rising panic. Did you honestly believe I would systematically dismantle my fraudulent husband and ignore the arrogant brother-in-law who helped him hide the stolen money? Did you truly think your prestigious position at the Avalon Fund would somehow protect you from the federal consequences of your greed? Preston lowered the phone slowly from his ear, his eyes wide with absolute terror as he stared directly at me. The call was from the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. While my forensic accounting team was busy unraveling the offshore crypto scams Marcus had built, they also found the undeniable digital trail of confidential corporate data Marcus had been illegally feeding directly to you. You used that stolen insider information to execute highly illegal trades through the Avalon Fund, artificially boosting your portfolio and securing those bonuses you brag about. I provided every single piece of that evidence directly to the SEC investigators at the exact same time I contacted the FBI. Your untouchable corporate accounts have just been completely frozen. You are officially under federal investigation for massive insider trading, and the Avalon Board of Directors fired you exactly 3 minutes ago. The realization of his total ruin hit Preston with the destructive force of a freight train. He was no longer the smug Wall Street titan lecturing me about high society decorum. He was a disgraced, unemployed criminal facing years in a federal penitentiary. The heavy, crushing weight of his catastrophic failure caused something inside his mind to completely snap. He turned his head and looked down at his wife. Chloe was still sitting on the floor, her pink designer gown ruined, staring up at him with a mixture of shock and desperate confusion. Instead of offering comfort, Preston exploded into a violent rage. "I hate you!" Preston screamed at the top of his lungs, his face turning a dark shade of purple. He pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at his terrified wife. "I absolutely hate you and your entire toxic, fraudulent family. You dragged me into this pathetic fake lifestyle. You made me think I was marrying into old money, but you are all just a bunch of broke, pathetic criminals. My entire life is completely ruined because of you. I am going to prison because of your idiotic brother. I curse the day I ever met you. I curse this family." Chloe burst into hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands as her husband publicly humiliated her. The federal agents reached the heavy wooden doors, dragging a loudly sobbing, completely broken Marcus out of the ballroom and into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers outside. Preston stormed off in the opposite direction, frantically screaming into his phone and aggressively shoving his way through the stunned, paralyzed crowd of Atlanta elites. The once mighty Vance family had been entirely reduced to a spectacle of weeping criminals and screaming traitors. Through it all, Vivian remained motionless on the cold marble floor, completely defeated, a silent testament to the deadly consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. I stood tall amidst the absolute wreckage of their lives, feeling the pure rush of righteous, perfectly executed punishment. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside cast long, eerie shadows across the grand ballroom. The magnificent birthday gala had been completely transformed into a graveyard of shattered crystal and ruined reputations. The elite guests remained pressed against the far walls, entirely silent, still struggling to process the rapid destruction of the Vance family. I stood in the center of the wreckage, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The camera slowly tracks my elegant footsteps as I turn away from the heavy wooden doors where my husband had just been dragged out in handcuffs. My damp designer heels click rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a sharp, precise sound that cuts through the lingering tension in the air. I walk back toward the center of the room where Vivian remains completely motionless on the floor. Malik steps out from the shadows, moving with his usual silent efficiency. He reaches into his tailored suit jacket and pulls out a sleek black leather folder. He extends his arm, handing the folder to me with a crisp, professional nod. I take the heavy folder from his hands, feeling the weight of their ultimate destruction resting perfectly in my palms. The threat had been neutralized, and now it was time to meticulously clean up the mess they had left behind. I walked deliberately toward the head of the ruined dining table, stepping over a puddle of spilled vintage champagne and a crushed orchid arrangement. I placed the black leather folder flat onto the white linen tablecloth and slowly open it. The sound of the thick leather unzipping causes Vivian to flinch visibly, her shoulders trembling as she anticipates the final blow. I reach inside and pull out 3 distinct stacks of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. I take the first stack and drop it forcefully onto the table. The heavy thud echoes across the silent room. "These are the formal divorce papers," I announce, my voice projecting clearly so that every single socialite and business executive in the room can hear the absolute finality of my decision. They are already fully signed and notarized by my legal team. I am permanently dissolving my marriage to Marcus, effective immediately. I have legally cited his massive financial fraud, his criminal activities, and his gross financial negligence as the primary grounds for the immediate dissolution of our union. Because I am the sole owner of the holding company that currently possesses every single piece of his outstanding debt, the presiding family court judge has already granted an emergency ruling in my favor. Marcus will receive absolutely nothing from my corporate empire. He will not get a single dime of spousal support. He will not get a settlement check. He leaves this marriage with nothing but the severe federal wire fraud charges waiting for him in a maximum security prison. I reach back into the sleek black folder and pull out the second stack of thick documents. I drop it directly next to the divorce papers, making sure the bold federal seal printed on the front page is clearly visible to everyone standing nearby. "This is an official asset freeze order directly from the Internal Revenue Service," I state. Watching Vivian's head slowly rise, her bloodshot eyes staring at the government paperwork in absolute horror. While my forensic accounting team was busy reporting Marcus to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they also audited your personal tax returns, Vivian. They discovered exactly how you have been illegally funneling borrowed money through offshore shell accounts to actively avoid paying your federal taxes for the last 7 years. The IRS does not take kindly to wealthy socialites treating the federal tax code like a casual suggestion. This legal document authorizes the United States government to immediately freeze and seize every bank account tied to your Social Security number. It gives them the absolute right to confiscate your expensive jewelry, your designer wardrobe, and any remaining liquid cash you have hidden away. You cannot touch a single penny. You cannot call a lawyer to fight this because you officially have no money left to pay a legal retainer. Your financial existence has been erased by the federal government. I slide my hand into the folder one last time and pull out a single sheet of bright yellow paper. It is stark and ugly, a massive contrast to the elegant surroundings of the country club. I drop the yellow paper directly on top of the other documents. "This is a formal eviction notice," I declare, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. As Preston so helpfully explained to the entire room earlier tonight, my parent company completely owns the deed to the historic Vance estate. "You have been living in my house for the last 2 years, Vivian. I have quietly paid your property taxes, your massive utility bills, and your exorbitant landscaping fees while you paraded around town treating me like absolute garbage. That arrangement is permanently over. You and your daughter have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property. By tomorrow evening at exactly 8 o'clock, a private security team will arrive at the estate to physically remove you from the premises. The heavy iron gates will be locked, the security codes will be permanently changed, and any items you leave behind will be immediately thrown into a dumpster. You no longer have a home in this city. You are officially trespassing on my private property, and I want you gone. The devastating reality of the eviction notice finally shatters the last remaining fragment of sanity in the room. Chloe, who has been sitting on the floor in a state of catatonic shock ever since Preston publicly abandoned her, suddenly realizes that she has nowhere to go. Her wealthy husband is gone. Her fraudulent brother is in federal custody. Her mother is bankrupt. She is a 30-year-old woman with no job, no money, and no home. She scrambles frantically across the wet marble floor, her ruined pink designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne. She crawls directly toward me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. She drops heavily to her knees at my feet, reaching out to grab the hem of my wet coat. "Zariah, please," she begs, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "You cannot do this to me. I have nothing left." Preston took all the credit cards and emptied our accounts. I do not have a single dollar to my name. Please let me stay in the tiny guest house. I will be quiet. I will do whatever you want. Please do not throw me out onto the cold street tonight. I literally have nowhere else to go. I looked down at her tear-stained face, remembering every time she cruelly mocked my background and called me worthless. I do not say a single word in response. I do not offer a shred of pity. I simply pull my coat away from her desperate grasp and walk right past her elegant footsteps, echoing loudly on the marble floor as if she does not even exist. I do not look down as I step past Chloe. Her desperate sobbing continues to echo against the marble floor, but the sound barely registers in my mind anymore. The elite guests of Atlanta high society, the billionaires, the old money heirs, and the powerful socialites who had previously looked at me with thinly veiled disdain now actively press themselves flat against the walls to ensure I have a wide, unobstructed path. Their eyes are wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound newfound respect. They have just witnessed the complete surgical dismantling of a family they considered untouchable, and they finally understand exactly who holds the real power in this city. I do not offer them a smile, and I do not acknowledge their sudden deference. I simply keep my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high, and walk with the steady, measured cadence of a woman who has just reclaimed her entire existence. Malik falls in step right behind me, his massive presence serving as a silent warning to anyone who might foolishly consider speaking to me. The camera smoothly pulls back on a Steadicam, capturing the majestic, sweeping movement of my exit. The opulent grand ballroom of the Biltmore Country Club, with its sparkling crystal chandeliers and pristine white linen tables, is completely unrecognizable. It looks like the aftermath of a devastating hurricane. Shattered glass glitters dangerously across the wet floor, and the once beautiful floral arrangements are crushed underfoot. As I approach the massive wooden double doors, the frantic overlapping noises of the ruined Vance family begin to blur together into a meaningless, pathetic hum. Vivian's hysterical wailing, Chloe's frantic pleading, and Preston's furious screaming merge with the chaotic murmurs of the terrified guests. But rising above all of that pathetic human noise is the sharp, undeniable wail of approaching police sirens. I step over the threshold of the ballroom, leaving the heavy wooden doors wide open behind me so the entire country club can witness the absolute destruction of the fake empire. The long, luxurious hallway of the country club stretches out before me, quiet and beautifully serene, compared to the absolute massacre I just orchestrated in the main dining hall. The thick, plush crimson carpet muffles the sharp clicking of my damp designer heels, creating a sudden, almost surreal sense of quiet isolation. The live jazz band has long since fled, leaving behind a heavy, echoing silence in the corridor. I walk past the expensive oil paintings and the ornate gold sconces, feeling the damp, heavy fabric of my ruined dress clinging to my skin. But instead of feeling cold or uncomfortable, I feel incredibly light. The suffocating weight of the Vance family name, the constant exhausting pressure to prove my worth to people who were entirely beneath me, has been completely lifted from my shoulders. For 2 years, I forced myself to shrink to hide my brilliant edge, to politely smile through their endless microaggressions and blatant disrespect. I financed their arrogant delusions while they actively tried to break my spirit. That era is permanently over. I am breathing freely for the first time since the day Marcus put a ring on my finger. As I reach the grand lobby of the Biltmore, the country club staff stands completely frozen behind the polished mahogany concierge desk. The general manager, a man who usually greets Vivian with excessive fawning praise, stares at me with his mouth slightly open. He has clearly heard the chaotic shouting and seen the heavily armed federal agents marching through his pristine lobby, but he is far too terrified to ask a single question. He quickly averts his eyes, staring fixedly at the floor in a profound display of total submission as I walk past his desk. I do not even glance in his direction. My focus is entirely on the massive glass entrance doors leading out into the night. The heavy glass sliding doors automatically part for me, releasing a rush of crisp, clean night air into the stuffy, overly perfumed lobby. I step across the threshold, finally leaving the suffocating artificial world of the country club behind me. The transition from the fake, heavily curated interior to the raw, unfiltered reality of the outside world is incredibly jarring, but absolutely necessary. The scene outside the main entrance is a masterclass in controlled chaos. Several federal law enforcement vehicles are parked at aggressive, haphazard angles across the pristine circular driveway, completely blocking the valets from retrieving any luxury cars. The flashing red and blue emergency lights bounce off the white columns of the country club entrance, painting the grand architecture in the harsh, unforgiving colors of the criminal justice system. A small crowd of valets and security guards stand huddled near the edge of the manicured lawn. They are all waiting for Marcus to be marched out in heavy steel handcuffs, completely unaware that the architect of this entire federal raid is calmly walking right past them. I navigate through the maze of police cruisers with effortless grace, completely unbothered by the heavy law enforcement presence. The federal agents recognize Malik, immediately exchanging brief, silent nods of professional acknowledgement with my head of security as we move toward my vehicle. They know exactly who provided the irrefutable evidence that made their massive bust possible tonight. My armored Mercedes Maybach is parked just beyond the perimeter of the federal vehicles, idling smoothly in the cool night air. The aggressive torrential storm that Vivian had gleefully abandoned me in just hours ago has completely passed. The violent howling wind has died down to a gentle, refreshing breeze, and the heavy, bruised iron clouds have finally broken apart, revealing the vast, dark expanse of the night sky. The freezing, punishing rain has entirely stopped, leaving behind a city that feels newly washed and profoundly cleansed. The air smells sharp and clean, carrying the distinct earthy scent of wet asphalt and crushed pine needles. Malik quickly steps ahead of me, his massive frame easily cutting through the cool air. He reaches the heavy bulletproof rear door of the Maybach and pulls it open with a smooth, effortless motion. The warm, inviting glow of the luxurious cabin spills out into the dark night, offering a safe, impregnable sanctuary from the absolute wreckage I have left in my wake. He stands perfectly still, holding the door steady and waiting for me to step inside. I pause for a fraction of a second before getting into the vehicle. I slowly turn my head, casting one final indifferent glance back at the brilliantly lit facade of the Biltmore Country Club. The sounds of the Vance family drowning in their own catastrophic ruin are entirely drowned out by the harsh mechanical wail of the police sirens. They are trapped in a prison of their own making, suffocating under the crushing weight of their massive debts and federal felonies. I have systematically stripped them of their wealth, their freedom, and their precious social standing. I have left them with absolutely nothing. I turn back toward the Maybach, looking down at the ground beneath my feet. The heavy downpour has left the country club driveway completely soaked. The vibrant, glowing lights of the Atlanta skyline are perfectly reflected in the dark, wet pavement, creating a beautiful, glittering mirror effect across the smooth asphalt. The city looks incredibly vast, powerful, and entirely mine for the taking. I step gracefully into the warm leather interior of the armored car, bringing my ruined designer heels onto the pristine floor mats. Malik firmly shuts the heavy door behind me, instantly sealing out the sirens, the flashing lights, and the pathetic remnants of the Vance family legacy. I close my eyes and breathe deeply, knowing this new chapter will be written on my terms. The transition back to the present moment is entirely seamless. I am no longer sitting in the back of the armored vehicle watching the city lights reflect against the wet pavement. I am standing right in the middle of my luxurious glass penthouse, high above the bustling streets of Atlanta. A smooth, medium camera shot would slowly glide around my physical position, capturing the absolute tranquility of my current reality. The chaotic memory of the country club and the pathetic downfall of the Vance family slowly fades into the quiet background of my mind. I raise the heavy crystal glass to my lips and take the final sip of my amber bourbon. The dark liquid burns pleasantly as it travels down my throat, leaving a warm, lingering sensation that perfectly matches the deep, profound sense of peace resting inside my chest. I gently place the empty crystal glass down onto the thick surface of my modern glass coffee table. The soft clinking sound echoes beautifully through the expansive living room, breaking the absolute silence. I walk slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, illuminated metropolis that I now completely own and control on my own terms. There is a very specific type of quiet that follows a massive storm. It is not just the absence of loud noises or the sudden cessation of violent winds. It is a deep, structural silence that tells you the absolute worst is finally over, and the necessary rebuilding can officially begin. For the past 2 years, my entire life was filled with the deafening, chaotic noise of other people and their endless, arrogant demands. I was constantly surrounded by the suffocating sounds of Vivian projecting her massive insecurities, Chloe, throwing her pathetic, spoiled tantrums, Marcus desperately begging for more money to cover his latest fraudulent failures, and Preston offering his unsolicited, racist financial advice. My mind was a crowded, noisy battlefield where I was constantly forced to defend my own fundamental right to exist and succeed. But tonight, my penthouse is completely silent. There are no frantic phone calls demanding emergency funds. There are no passive-aggressive text messages about country club etiquette. There is absolutely nobody left to constantly belittle my incredible self-made achievements or actively mock the working-class neighborhood where I originally learned how to survive and thrive. The silence in this room is the most expensive luxury I possess. As I stand here looking down at the glittering city skyline, I cannot help but deeply reflect on the incredibly dangerous cultural trap that kept me imprisoned in that toxic marriage for so long. In our community, we are constantly force-fed the absolute, undeniable sanctity of the family unit. From the time we are young children, we are aggressively taught that family is the absolute most important thing in the world. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and that we must always protect our own people, regardless of the circumstances or the personal cost. The phrase family first is repeated so often that it becomes a heavy, invisible chain wrapped tightly around our necks. We are actively conditioned to quietly absorb massive amounts of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and blatant disrespect simply because the people inflicting the severe trauma happen to share our last name or sit at our holiday dinner tables. We are expected to constantly turn the other cheek, to gracefully forgive the absolute unforgivable, and to fiercely protect the public reputation of the family legacy, even when that legacy is actively crushing our own individual spirits into the ground. This blind, unconditional loyalty is constantly weaponized against the strongest and most successful members of the family tree. The people who actually work hard, who break the cycles of poverty, and build real tangible wealth, are immediately expected to become the designated saviors for everyone else. We become the endless financial safety nets for the lazy, the reckless, and the deeply arrogant. The Vance family weaponized this toxic concept of loyalty with absolute terrifying precision. Vivian constantly demanded my total submission and my financial resources in the holy name of preserving their historic generational wealth. She truly believed that my money belonged to the collective family pot, while my opinions and my basic human dignity belonged entirely in the garbage. They expected me to silently absorb their cruel insults, endure their blatant classism, and continuously fund their fake opulent lifestyle because I was legally bound to them by marriage. They wanted me to be a quiet, obedient automatic teller machine wrapped in a designer dress. They used the sacred concept of family loyalty as a convenient shield to completely hide their massive parasitic behavior from the outside world, while they aggressively drained my resources dry. But standing out in that freezing rainstorm, completely abandoned on the side of a desolate highway, I finally realized the absolute terrifying truth. Blind loyalty to highly toxic people is never a noble virtue. It is nothing but slow, painful, emotional, and financial suicide. When you continuously sacrifice your own peace, your own hard-earned resources, and your own fundamental self-respect to fiercely protect people who secretly despise you. You are not preserving a family legacy. You are actively participating in your own complete destruction. You are feeding your own flesh to a pack of starving wolves and hoping they will eventually learn how to love you back. They will never love you. They will only love what you can constantly provide for them until you are completely empty and broken. I refuse to let the Vance family bleed me dry. I refuse to be a tragic cautionary tale of a successful woman who lost her entire empire because she was too deeply afraid to break a toxic family tradition. Walking away from them was not an act of cruel vengeance or bitter spite. It was the ultimate necessary act of pure radical self-preservation and absolute self-love. I had to completely smash their fake glittering facade into a million pieces. There was absolutely no other way to effectively neutralize the massive threat they posed to my life and my business. If I had simply filed for a quiet, private divorce, Marcus would have spent years dragging me through the corrupt family court system, desperately trying to steal half of my corporate holding company. Vivian would have used her vast social connections to ruthlessly smear my professional reputation and permanently destroy my highly lucrative security contracts. I could not simply walk away from the burning building. I had to completely detonate the entire structure and salt the earth, so nothing toxic could ever grow there again. Exposing their massive bankruptcy, their federal crimes, and their absolute moral bankruptcy in front of the entire Atlanta elite was the only possible way to earn my true permanent freedom. I am finally free from their crushing gravity, and the view from the top is incredibly beautiful. Suddenly, the profound silence of the luxurious penthouse is interrupted by a sharp, distinct mechanical sound. My secure cellular phone vibrates aggressively against the smooth glass coffee table, illuminating my calm face with a bright, white glowing screen. I step away from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and walk slowly back toward the center of the living room. The bright, white glowing screen of my secure cellular phone continues to illuminate the dark surface of the modern glass coffee table. The aggressive vibration creates a sharp, continuous buzzing sound that demands my immediate attention. I reach down and pick up the device, the cool metal casing feeling solid and grounding in my palm. A highly encrypted notification from my primary offshore private bank is flashing boldly across the locked display. I easily unlock the digital screen now. The finalized financial report my elite accounting team has been meticulously preparing for the last 48 hours appears. The bold green numbers displayed on the high-definition screen are absolute perfection. It is a fully cleared, non-reversible 8-figure digital wire transfer. The massive deposit officially represents the absolute final liquidation of the historic Vance family estate. Every single asset they previously weaponized against me has been successfully auctioned off to the highest anonymous bidder, converted into liquid capital, and deposited directly into my personal holding company accounts, ensuring total, final, absolute, permanent legal financial dominance over them. The sprawling multi-million-dollar colonial mansion, with its perfectly manicured lawns and heated swimming pool, now officially belongs to a foreign real estate developer. He plans to bulldoze the entire property and build modern luxury condominiums. The vintage designer wardrobes, the heavily collateralized emerald necklaces, and the fleet of leased luxury vehicles were all quietly seized and liquidated through private brokers before the sun even came up this morning. Vivian is currently sitting in a cheap motel room on the absolute outskirts of the city, completely stripped of her fake, highly curated, toxic, aristocratic social identity right now today. She is desperately trying to figure out how to survive without her predatory black credit cards. Marcus is sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit. He was completely denied bail because the federal judge officially deemed him a massive flight risk. Chloe and Preston are aggressively fighting through a bitter, highly publicized divorce, desperately pointing fingers at one another, while the federal government systematically dismantles whatever tiny fraction of wealth they had left. The fake glittering empire that terrorized me for 2 full years has been completely wiped off the map, permanently forever. I stare down at the 8-figure balance on my screen, but I do not feel a sudden overwhelming rush of typical greed. The massive influx of capital is certainly a beautiful addition to my already extensive financial portfolio, but the money itself was never the actual objective. I built my own wealth long before I ever met the Vance family, and I will continue to build it long after they are completely forgotten by the Atlanta elite. This specific deposit represents something infinitely more valuable than simple currency to me right now, at this very exact, pivotal, triumphant moment. It represents absolute, undeniable accountability. It is the physical, numeric manifestation of my total victory over a toxic system that desperately tried to consume me. It is the ultimate receipt proving that you cannot continuously abuse, belittle, and exploit a highly intelligent woman without eventually paying the absolute highest possible price. I slowly lock the screen of my phone and slide the sleek device into the deep pocket of my tailored designer trousers. The heavy, lingering weight of my past has been completely lifted, replaced by an incredible, exhilarating sense of absolute forward momentum. I am completely, entirely, fully ready. The heavy, soundproof oak door leading into my private penthouse suite opens with a soft, almost imperceptible click. Malik steps smoothly into the expansive living room, his massive frame moving with the exact same calculated, silent precision he utilized perfectly at the country club. He is dressed in a fresh, perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his earpiece securely positioned, projecting the ultimate image of high-end private security. He stops exactly 5 feet away from me, standing with his broad shoulders pulled back and his hands clasped respectfully in front of him, awaiting my next absolute, direct, clear, final command. "Madam," he states, his deep, resonant voice easily cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the luxurious penthouse. "The flight logistics have been fully secured and confirmed. Your private helicopter is currently waiting on the rooftop helipad. The flight crew is completely prepped, and we are absolutely ready for immediate departure whenever you give the command." I offer him a single, subtle nod of complete approval. "Perfect timing, Malik," I reply, my voice perfectly calm and incredibly steady. "Let us leave this city behind for a few days." The sheer poetic contrast of this specific, triumphant, incredible moment is absolutely beautiful. Just 3 days ago, I was completely abandoned on the muddy shoulder of a desolate, freezing highway, shivering in the pouring rain, while a toxic, arrogant woman fully expected me to break down and beg. Tonight, I am taking a private elevator directly up to the roof of my own glass skyscraper, stepping into a multi-million-dollar private helicopter and flying high above the very clouds that previously rained down on me. A slow, highly deliberate camera push in begins to seamlessly track my quiet movement, gliding smoothly through the quiet space, focusing exclusively tightly on my strong face. The cinematic push in continues relentlessly until nothing else exists in the frame except the fierce, unyielding, and completely liberated expression shining brilliantly in my dark eyes. I look directly, piercingly into the center of the camera lens, completely breaking the invisible fourth wall. The silence creates a profound anticipation. Never let anyone leave you in the rain, I state calmly, unless you are the one who owns the sky that day. I turn and confidently walk entirely out of the visual frame. The camera softly lingers on the empty bourbon glass. Fade to black. The absolute perfect, beautiful end.